In the blood-soaked Ohio territory of 1785, a bride's defiance will ignite a war. Sarah Montgomery didn't just leave a groom at the altar. She shattered 2 centuries of iron-clad tradition and unleashed a storm of vengeance. Her uncle James, known as the Butcher of Bear Creek, after slaughtering an entire village, now leads a pack of merciless hunters with orders to drag her back in chains or return with her scalp. But these woods belong to Standing Bear, the deadliest Shawnee warrior in 3 generations. They call him Death's Shadow. No settler who has crossed his path has lived to tell the tale. When Sarah's desperate flight collides with his hunting grounds, blood will flow. What follows is not just a story of survival. This is how one woman's rebellion turned her own flesh and blood into predators, and her greatest enemy into her only hope for salvation. Before we witness this savage tale unfold, tell us where you're watching from, and if you're ready for bloodshed. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's chapter will show you why they called him Death's Shadow. The string of pearls lay coiled like a pale serpent on Sarah Montgomery's pillow, catching the first grey light of dawn. Her fingers trembled as she arranged the necklace, her mother's most treasured possession, into a deliberate shape. A question mark, a final defiance. Through the window of her second-story bedroom, mist clung to the valley below Blackbrook, manna, shrouding the preparations for what should have been her wedding day. Sarah pressed her hand against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the pain. Below, servants scurried between the manor house and the chapel, carrying white ribbons and flowers. They looked like ants from this height, so insignificant compared to the vast wilderness beyond. That wilderness called to her now, as it had, since childhood, promising something her family's rigid traditions never could: freedom. The riding clothes she'd stolen from her younger brother Timothy felt strange against her skin. The rough wool so different from the silk wedding dress hanging like a ghost in her wardrobe. She'd plaited her long, dark hair tight against her head, tucked it beneath a cap. The mirror showed her a stranger, exactly what she needed to become. Her uncle's prized stallion, Thunder, shifted restlessly in the pre-dawn shadows beneath her window. She'd spent weeks secretly preparing him, stealing moments to gain his trust with apple cores and gentle words. Now he waited, as if understanding the magnitude of what was to come. Sarah touched the cold metal of her father's pistol, tucked into her borrowed belt. 1 shot. That's all she'd have if they caught her. But it wouldn't be for them. She'd made that decision the night her Uncle James announced her betrothal to Edgar Whitfield, a man 40 years her senior with 3 dead wives and a reputation that made even hardened frontier men whisper. The massive family Bible lay open on her desk, its pages illuminated by a single candle. Sarah ran her fingers over the generations of marriages recorded there, each one a calculated alliance to build the Montgomery Empire. Her eyes lingered on her mother's name, the ink still seeming fresh after 15 years. Elizabeth Rothschild Montgomery, married to William Montgomery, August 12, 1770. Below that, in her uncle's severe hand, deceased July 4th, 1785. No mention of how they'd found her in the river, her body tangled in river weeds, her secrets taken to a watery grave. The first bell tolled from the chapel, calling the household to morning prayers. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering her mother's face the morning she'd given her the pearl necklace. "Sometimes, my dear," she'd whispered, "a woman must choose her own path, no matter the cost." Those were the last words she'd spoken before. Sarah's hand jerked away from the Bible as the second bell tolled. In the distance, she could see the first wedding guests' carriages winding up the valley road. Among them would be Edgar Whitfield, coming to claim his 4th wife. Her stomach churned at the thought of his yellowed smile, his liver-spotted hands that had pawed at her during their chaperoned meetings. She swung one leg over the window-sill, found the familiar foothold in the ancient oak that had been her escape route since childhood. The rough bark bit into her palms as she descended, each movement deliberate, silent. Thunder's ears pricked forward at her approach, but he remained still, understanding the need for stealth. As Sarah mounted, adjusting her seat to ride astride rather than side-saddle for the first time in her life, the third bell began to toll. She nudged Thunder toward the tree line, and just as the sound faded, they burst into a gallop. The thunder of hooves on soft earth matched her heartbeat as they plunged into the forest's embrace. Behind her, the bells of Blackbrook Manor began to ring in earnest, no longer calling for prayer, but raising an alarm. Sarah leaned low over Thunder's neck, urging him faster. She knew she had perhaps an hour before they discovered her empty. Room, the pearl necklace, the abandoned wedding dress. An hour before her Uncle James unleashed hell itself to hunt her down. She could picture him now, returning from his dawn patrol of the property borders. He'd be wearing his signature black coat, the one that had earned him his nickname at Bear Creek, the coat that had been spattered with blood that day when he'd led the militia against a peaceful settlement, claiming they were Indian sympathizers. Sarah had been 12, watching from her window as he returned, his coat darker in places, his eyes colder than she'd ever seen them. That same cold fury would be unleashed on her trail soon enough. But for now, she was free. The wind whipped. Tears from her eyes as Thunder carried her deeper into the wilderness. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and quite possibly death. Behind lay a prison built of tradition and cruelty. Dressed up in silk and propriety, Thunder's hooves thundered across a shallow stream, sending spray glittering in the early morning light. Sarah Montgomery, the dutiful daughter of Blackbrook Manor, ceased to exist with each powerful stride of Thunder's legs. What emerged from the chrysalis of that dawn was something else entirely, something wild, desperate, and free, just like her mother had been in those final days before the river claimed her. Standing Bear moved through the morning mist like a shadow, each step as silent as falling snow. The war club at his belt, his father's legacy, hung heavy with both weight and meaning. 3 generations of Shawnee warriors had carried it before him, its scarred surface marking victories and losses alike. Now it served as both weapon and reminder. He was the last of his father's line, and with that came the burden of protecting what remained of their people's lands. Dawn painted the forest in shades of gold and shadow as he traced the boundary that existed only in the white man's treaties. Such invisible lines meant nothing to the deer he tracked, nor to the settlers who increasingly ignored them. His scouts had reported 3 new homesteads built beyond the agreed limits this month alone. Each encroachment pushed his people closer, to a decision he had hoped to avoid. The sound came to him on the wind, distant but distinctive, hoofbeats moving fast and hard through the western creek lands. Standing Bear melted into the shadows of an ancient oak, becoming one with its weathered bark. The rider was either desperate or foolish to move at such speed in these woods. Such reckless noise would draw every hostile eye for miles. He caught the flash of a rider through the trees, someone who sat a horse like they'd been born to it, but whose path wound with the uncertainty of one unfamiliar with these lands. Ifiwu. Horse was a magnificent beast, bred for speed and power. Standing Bear recognized it immediately, the black stallion from the settler fort, the one belonging to the man they called the Butcher. But this was not the Butcher who rode it. The rider passed close enough for Standing Bear to see beneath the borrowed cap. A woman, young, with determination etched into every line of her face. She rode astride, dressed in men's clothes, fear and freedom warring in her eyes. A fugitive then, and one of significance given the horse she'd stolen. Behind her, carried on the same wind, came the first faint calls of pursuit. Hunting horns, still distant but drawing closer. Standing Bear knew their meaning well. The sound had haunted too many of his people's own desperate flights. The hunters would not be far behind. He touched the war club at his belt, feeling the smooth grooves worn by generations of his ancestors' hands. The old ways demanded he remain uninvolved in settler disputes. His father's voice whispered from memory, "Their quarrels are not our quarrels. Their justice is not our justice." But something in the woman's desperate flight called to him, echoing older memories. His sister's face the day the raiders came, her defiance in the face of those who would cage her spirit. The war club carried another mark, one his father had made the day they lost her. A single deep groove that spoke of vengeance taken, but too late to save what mattered most. Standing Bear's fingers found that groove now, as they always did when such memories surfaced. From the village behind him came the distant sound of mourning drums, calling his people to council. Another border violation would need to be discussed. Another decision made about how to respond to the settlers' endless pushing at their boundaries. His presence would be expected. As lead warrior, his voice carried weight in these discussions. The hunting horns sounded again, closer now. The woman had passed beyond his sight, but he could track her path easily enough. She was making no effort to hide her trail. She would not survive long, not with such skilled hunters on her trail. Already he could hear the baying of dogs joining the horns. Standing Bear pulled his hand away from the war club, straightening to his full height. The morning sun caught the eagle feather in his hair, casting its shadow across the forest floor. His people named him for his strength, but they whispered about his silences. The way he could vanish into the forest like a spirit. Some said he walked with the shadows themselves, gathering their secrets. He began to move, parallel to the woman's trail but deeper in the forest's embrace. He would watch, for now. The situation concerned him, not just the pursuit itself, but what it might mean for the delicate peace his people maintained with the settlers. If blood was shed here in these disputed lands, it could spark the very conflict he'd worked so hard to prevent. The morning drums faded behind him as he ghosted through the trees. Ahead, the woman's path wound dangerously close to Deadman's Gulch, where the creek cut deep through treacherous rocks. If she wasn't careful, her flight would end there, regardless of her pursuers. Standing Bear carried no illusions about the peace his people currently held with the settlers. He had seen too many treaties broken, too many promises turned to ash, but he had also seen the cost of war, the price paid in blood and grief by both sides. His father's war club carried the weight of those lessons, each notch and scar a story of loss. The forest whispered its secrets to him as he moved. More riders approaching from the south, trying to cut off the woman's escape. They knew these lands better than she did, were herding her toward the gulch. Standing Bear felt the familiar tension building in his shoulders, the warrior's instinct warning him that blood would be shed before this day was done. Behind him lay his village, his responsibilities, the delicate balance he helped maintain between his people's traditions and the ever-encroaching tide of settlers. Ahead lay uncertainty, a woman's desperate bid for freedom, and the very real possibility that any intervention would shatter the fragile peace he'd helped build. The war club hung heavy at his belt, his ancestors' spirits watching, waiting to see what choice he would make. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist, as Standing Bear moved like a shadow through his father's forests, following the path of a desperate woman who dared to choose freedom over chains. James Montgomery stood before. The great hearth of Blackbrook Manor, the family map of the Ohio Territory, spread across the massive oak table before him. His black coat, still damp with morning dew, cast water onto the carefully inked borders that marked their lands. Behind him, the first rays of sun painted the room blood-red through the stained-glass windows, bearing the Montgomery family crest. She, who took thunder. His voice carried the chill of a winter storm. The assembled men, hardened frontiersmen all, shifted uneasily. They knew that tone. Had heard it 15 years ago, the day he'd led them to Bear Creek. Mason Reed, their best tracker, traced a weathered finger along the map's eastern edge. The beast's got speed, but he'll leave a trail a blind man could follow. She'll head north. He tapped a section marked with careful hatch marks, towards Shawnee territory. Girl's smart enough to know that's where we'd least want to follow. Then she doesn't know me well enough. James's fingers found the bone-handled knife at his belt, the same blade that had earned him his nickname at Bear Creek. Send runners to the outlying farms. I want every able man who can track or shoot. His eyes fell on the family Bible, still open to the marriage records. And bring me Edgar Whitfield. The men dispersed like smoke in wind, leaving only Harrison. Wells, James's longtime second, behind. The girl's blood, James, your brother's daughter. She stopped being blood the moment she shamed this family. James traced the territory boundaries on the map, his finger lingering over the red ink marking Shawnee lands, just like her mother before her. Wells shifted uncomfortably. Some still whisper about Elizabeth's death. If word spreads about Sarah, then we'll give them something new to whisper about. James rolled the map with decisive motions. Gather the dogs. We ride in 1 hour. Outside, the hunting horns began to sound, their deep brass notes echoing across the valley. James watched from the window as riders appeared on the surrounding ridges, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. From the chapel came the sound of Edgar Whitfield's arrival, the angry bellow of a man who'd been made a fool of. James touched the knife at his belt again, remembering another morning, another hunt. Elizabeth had run too, all those years ago, had nearly reached the river before they caught her, nearly reached the Shawnee brave who'd filled her head with dreams of freedom. The doors burst open as Edgar Whitfield stormed in, his face purple with rage. "Where is she? Where's my bride?" James turned slowly, letting the older man see the cold purpose in his eyes. "She's made her choice, Edgar. Now we make ours." He gestured to the assembled hunting party forming in the courtyard below. "You're welcome to join us, to watch as we show everyone what happens when a Montgomery breaks faith." Edgar's rage turned to something darker, a smile that had probably graced his face the day they found his third wife face down in her soup bowl. "Do try to bring her back breathing, James. I so look forward to teaching her proper manners." James's answering smile held all the warmth of a winter grave. "That, old friend, will depend entirely on how long she makes us chase her." The hunting horns sounded again, closer now. Through the window, James could see Mason Reed organizing the dog handlers, the hounds straining at their leashes as they caught Sarah's scent from her abandoned wedding dress. In the distance, thunder rolled across clear skies. His stallions, hooves carrying his rebellious niece further into danger with every stride. Let her run, he thought, touching the knife one final time. The wilderness might seem like freedom, but it had teeth, and he had trained most of those teeth himself. "Mount up," he called, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "We ride to restore the family honor." The answering cheer echoed off the manor walls like a death knell as 50 of the territory's most ruthless men prepared to hunt down one desperate girl. The same men who'd helped him clean up the mess at Bear Creek, who knew how to keep their mouths shut and their consciences quiet. Thunder's hooves punched through the stream's surface, sending crystalline spray into the morning air. Sarah fought, to control her breathing, to listen past the hammering of her heart. The hunting horns had gone quiet, a silence more terrifying than their brassy calls. It meant the hunters had picked up her trail, the silver brooch from her wedding dress caught, the sunlight where it had snagged on her borrowed shirt, a glinting betrayal of her position. She yanked it free, letting it fall into the flowing water. The current carried it away, along with any remaining illusions about her old life. Movement flickered through the trees to her left. Sarah yanked Thunder's reins, veering hard right. The crack of a rifle split the air. Thunder screamed, rearing as the bullet splintered bark inches from his head. Sarah clung to his neck as he bolted, no longer needing her guidance to flee. "There," a voice shouted. "Take the shot." Sarah recognized that voice. Luke Harrison, one of her uncle's most vicious trackers. The man who'd laughed while describing how they dealt with Indian sympathizers at Bear Creek. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Thunder's panic drove them deeper into unknown territory, branches whipping Sarah's face as they crashed through the underbrush. A fallen log appeared in their path. Thunder gathered himself, launching over it in a desperate leap. Sarah felt herself slipping, the unfamiliar position of riding astride betraying her. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Thunder galloped on without her taking with him any hope of outrunning her pursuers. Through blurred vision, Sarah saw her father's pistol had fallen nearby. She crawled toward it, fingers closing around the grip just as Boots appeared at the edge of her vision. Well, well. Luke Harrison's tobacco-stained grin loomed over her. The little lady wants to play with guns. Behind him, two more of her. Uncle's men emerged from the trees, rifles ready. Sarah's hand tightened on the pistol. One shot. But before she could raise it, Harrison's boot came down on her wrist. Bones ground together as he pressed his weight into it. Now, that wouldn't be proper for a Montgomery lady, would it? He reached down, prying the gun from her fingers. Your uncle wants you back alive, but he didn't say nothing about unmarked. A twig snapped in the forest behind them. Harrison turned, irritation crossing his face. Check it, he barked at one of his men. Probably that damn horse circling back. The man nodded, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. Silence followed, then a wet, gurgling sound that Sarah would hear in her nightmares for years to come. Harrison's boot lifted from her wrist as he spun, rifle rising. What the hell? The second man jerked, an arrow sprouting from his throat. He toppled without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. Harrison fired blindly into the trees, his curses cut short as something dark and fast emerged from the shadows. Sarah caught a glimpse of an eagle feather, the blur of a war club. Then Harrison was falling, his head twisted at an impossible angle. Sarah scrambled backward, her bruised wrist cradled against her chest. Her father's pistol lay in the leaves beside Harrison's body. She lunged for it, coming up with the gun aimed into the shadows where her savior, or perhaps her executioner, waited. Your shot would miss, a deep voice said from the darkness, and there are more of your people coming. The shadows shifted, revealing a tall warrior, his face painted with stark lines that made him seem part of the forest itself. Blood dripped from the war club in his hand, its surface marked with generations of similar encounters. Behind them, hunting horns began to sound again. The warrior's eyes met hers, carrying neither mercy nor malice. Run or die, he said simply. They will be here soon. Sarah hesitated only a moment before fleeing into the trees, her father's pistol clutched in trembling fingers. Behind her, the warrior melted back into the forest, leaving only 3 cooling bodies as evidence of what line had just been crossed. Sarah's lungs burned as she crashed through the underbrush, each breath a desperate gasp in the mountain air. Her father's compass bounced against her chest with every stride, its arrow spinning wildly, as useless in guiding her as the prayers she'd been raised on. Behind her, the hunting horns had taken on a different tone, deeper, angrier. They'd found Harrison's body. The ground began to slope downward, the forest thinning until she burst out onto a rocky outcrop. Below, the river churned between steep banks, its waters swollen with spring rains. Sarah dropped to her knees, heart pounding as she tried to orient herself. The compass had been her father's pride, its brass case engraved with careful markings. For surveying new territories. Now it might be all that kept her from running in circles until her uncle's men found her. North, she whispered, wiping blood from a scratch on her cheek. Keep moving north. The needle steadied, pointing toward what she hoped was Shawnee territory, the same direction her mother had tried to flee all those years ago. The sound of dogs baying echoed through the trees. Closer now. Sarah forced herself to think past the panic clawing at her throat. The river would mask her scent, but crossing it, her eyes traced the current's savage path through the gorge. The waters that had claimed her mother now offered both salvation and death. Movement on the opposite bank caught her eye. Thunder, her uncle's stallion, paced nervously at the water's edge. He must have circled around, driven by instinct to find water, if she could reach him. A branch snapped in the forest behind her. Sarah whirled, raising her father's pistol toward the sound. The warrior from before emerged like a shadow, taking form, his war club dark with drying blood. "The crossing is deeper upstream," he said, his voice low but carrying easily over the river's roar. "Follow the game trail." He pointed to a barely visible path leading along the bank. Sarah kept the pistol leveled at his chest, though her arm trembled with exhaustion. "Why are you helping me?" The warrior's eyes flickered to the compass hanging from her neck, then back to her face. Something like recognition crossed his features. "I have seen that compass before," he said, "on another who fled these woods." Sarah's breath caught. "My mother." The river took her before we could reach her. His words carried the weight of old regrets. "But you are not your mother, and this day does not have to end like that one." Dogs bayed again, much closer now. The warrior melted back into the forest without another word, leaving Sarah to make her choice. She tucked the pistol into her belt and began to run, following the game trail upstream. The rocky path twisted treacherously under her feet. One wrong step away from sending her into the churning waters below. Thunder nickered as she approached, ears pricking forward in recognition. Sarah whispered desperate encouragement as she drew closer, praying he remembered the treats and gentle words she'd offered in secret over the past weeks. The stallion stood his ground as she reached for his reins, but the trust she'd built was fragile. One wrong move, one sudden sound, a rifle cracked. The bullet kicked up stone splinters near Sarah's feet. Thunder reared, eyes rolling in panic. Sarah lunged, managing to grab his reins as he came down. She swung onto his back just as more. Shots rang out, spurring him toward the river's edge. "Take her alive!" Her uncle's voice carried over the water. "Alive!" Thunder fought her as she urged him into the current, but terror of the gunfire proved stronger than his fear of the water. The river grabbed them, its cold fingers yanking them into the main channel. Sarah clung to Thunder's mane as he swam, the current sweeping them downstream. Through the spray, she glimpsed figures on both banks, her uncle's men racing to cut them off, and darker shapes moving like shadows through the trees on the far side. The compass bounced against her chest, its needle spinning uselessly as they fought the current. Thunder's hooves found purchase on the far bank. They burst from the river in a spray of silver, just as another volley of shots kicked up water around them. Sarah pressed herself low against Thunder's neck as they galloped into the shelter of the trees, leaving the sounds of pursuit behind. She'd crossed more than just a river. She'd crossed into Shawnee territory, where her uncle's authority meant nothing. But as Thunder's pace settled into a ground-eating stride, Sarah remembered the warrior's words. She was not her mother, and this story would have a different ending. The sun hung high overhead when Sarah finally allowed Thunder to slow. Blood had soaked through her shirt sleeve, turning the rough wool black. One of the shots during their crossing had found its mark after all, carving a deep furrow along her upper arm. Each hoofbeat sent fresh pain, lancing through her shoulder. Thunder's sides heaved beneath her legs, his black coat dark with sweat and river water. They couldn't keep this pace much longer. Sarah slid from his back, legs buckling as she hit the ground. The world tilted sickeningly as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. Through blurred vision, she spotted a small leather pouch hanging from a low branch, deliberately placed. Inside, she found dried herbs and a strip of clean cloth. Medicine left by unseen hands. The same shadows that had helped her cross the river were still watching, still guiding her path. Sarah's fingers trembled as she pressed the herbs against her wound, biting back a cry at the burning sensation. The cloth served as a crude bandage, but it would have to do. Thunder nudged her shoulder, his warm breath carrying concern. She leaned against his solid presence, trying to gather her strength. "You're leaving a trail a blind man could follow." Sarah spun toward the voice, nearly falling as dizziness swept over her. Standing Bear emerged from the shadows, his war club replaced by a long rifle. His eyes tracked to her bandaged arm, then to the blood-dotted leaves behind her. "The herbs will help," he said, "but you need proper healing." He moved closer, each step silent despite the carpet of dry leaves. "Your uncle's men have crossed the river in 3 places. They do not respect boundaries of land or law." Sarah straightened, fighting to clear her head. "Why do you keep helping me?" Standing Bear's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. "Your mother carried the same compass, spoke of the same dreams of freedom." His gaze shifted to the trees. "She didn't live to reach our village. The river took her before—" He stopped, head tilting as he listened to something. "Sarah couldn't hear. They're closer than you think," he said. "Your wound bleeds freely. The dogs will find you soon." He pulled a small object from his belt, a hide pouch of different herbs. "These will mask your scent, but you must keep moving north. There is a cave system. Half a day's ride. Look for 3 white birch trees growing together." Sarah took the pouch, her fingers brushing his. The contact seemed to startle them both. "My mother," she said quickly, "did she have help? Like you're helping me?" A shadow crossed Standing Bear's face. "She had more than help. She had—" He cut off again, but this time Sarah heard it too. Dogs baying in the distance. "Go," he said, melting back into the forest. "Follow the birch trees. I will lead them. East." Sarah pulled herself back onto Thunder's back, gritting her teeth against the pain. The herb pouch bounced against her hip as they moved deeper into Shawnee territory. Behind them, rifle shots rang out, Standing Bear creating a false trail. To draw her pursuers away, the afternoon wore on as Sarah pushed Thunder as hard as she dared. Her arm throbbed in time with his hoofbeats, the bandage now soaked through. The herbs had helped with the pain, but fever was setting in, making the forest swim before her eyes. She found herself thinking of her mother, wondering if she had felt this same desperation, this same mix of fear and hope. 3 white birch trees, the instruction became a mantra as she fought to stay conscious. 3 white birch trees. Her mother had almost made it to safety, had almost found whatever she was seeking in these same woods. Sarah touched the compass at her neck, its weight now carrying the burden of 2 generations' worth of desperate flight. Thunder's ears suddenly pricked forward. Through the fever haze, Sarah saw them, 3 pale trunks rising like ghosts from the darkening forest. Standing Bear had spoken true, but as Thunder carried her toward the promised sanctuary, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was following her mother's path in more ways than one, and behind her, carried on the cooling evening air, came the relentless baying of the dogs. A peace pipe lay broken on the council fire's stones, its pieces still smoking faintly in the gathering dusk. Standing Bear faced the tribal elders, his father's war club, held loose but ready at his side. The weight of tradition pressed down on him like storm clouds. "You have brought trouble to our lands." Grey Wolf, the eldest, spoke into the tense silence. "The girl carries the same darkness that came before. When her mother fled here," Standing Bear's grip tightened on the war club, "she carries her mother's courage, not her fate." "Her mother's choice brought death to our people," another elder cut in. "The butcher of Bear Creek used her as an excuse to murder an entire village. Will you risk the same again?" The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Standing Bear remembered that day, the smoke rising from the massacred village, the screams that had echoed through these very woods. He had been younger then, unable to prevent what followed, but he was not that same warrior now. "I have seen her uncle's men cross our boundaries with weapons drawn," Standing Bear said. "They come whether we help the girl or not. At least this way. We choose the ground on which we meet them." Grey Wolf's aged fingers traced the broken peace pipe. "You speak of choice, but I see your father in your eyes, the same fire that led him to shelter her mother." He lifted his gaze to Standing Bear. The same fire that got him killed. The words struck like physical blows, but Standing Bear held his ground. My father died protecting what he believed was right. I would dishonor his memory by doing less. A commotion at the edge of the council circle interrupted their debate. A young scout burst through, breathing hard. The girl reaches the cave system, but she burns with fever. The wound, he shook his head. And the hunters have split into 3 groups. They carry torches. Standing Bear turned back to the elders. They will burn the forest to find her. This is no longer about one girl. This is about our lands, our people. Grey Wolf was silent for a long moment, the firelight deepening the lines in his ancient face. Finally, he nodded. Go, but understand the price of this choice. If war comes from this, the blood will be on your hands. Standing Bear touched his father's war club to his forehead in acknowledgement, then turned to leave. Grey Wolf's voice stopped him at the circle's edge. She is not your sister, Standing Bear. You cannot change the past by saving her. No, Standing Bear agreed, not turning back. But I can change the future. He ran through the darkness, 4 of his best warriors falling in silently behind him. The moon had risen, painting the forest in silver shadows. In the distance, torchlight flickered through the trees. The hunters, drawing ever closer to their prey. They found Sarah's horse, first, standing guard outside the cave entrance. The stallion's nostrils flared at their approach, but something in the animal recognized their intent. It stepped aside, letting Standing Bear pass. Sarah lay just inside the cave mouth, her skin burning with fever. The bandage on her arm had soaked through again, and her breath came in short gasps. The compass still hung around her neck, its brass surface reflecting the moonlight that reached into the cave. Like her mother, Two Rivers, the oldest of his warriors, whispered. The same cave, the same fever, the spirits repeat themselves. Standing Bear knelt beside Sarah's unconscious form. Then we will give them a different ending. He lifted her carefully, feeling the heat of infection radiating through her clothes. Two Rivers, take her horse north to the summer hunting grounds. Make the trail clear. Swift Deer, set false trails east and west. The rest of you, with me. We go to the healing caves. As they moved deeper into the cave system, Standing Bear heard the distant sound of dogs baying. Behind them, torchlight flickered like angry spirits through the trees. They were gambling everything, peace, safety, the future of their people, on one girl's life. Standing Bear thought of his father, of the choice he had made 15 years ago when another desperate woman had fled through these woods. That choice had ended in blood and fire. But as Sarah's fever-racked body shivered in his arms, Standing Bear felt the weight of his father's war club at his side and knew he could make no other choice. The healing caves waited ahead, their ancient walls holding secrets older than any of their people's conflicts. Whether those walls would shelter them long enough for Sarah to heal or become their tomb would depend on how well they had learned. From the past's bitter lessons, the first shots came with the dawn. Standing Bear counted 4 rifles, their reports echoing through the ravine leading to the healing caves. His warriors had drawn the hunters into the killing ground, a narrow approach that left them exposed to arrows from above. A warrior's feather drifted down from the cliffs, landing at the hunter's feet. The simple warning went unheeded. More. Men pushed into the ravine, their torches casting wild shadows on the rock walls. Standing Bear recognized the butcher among them, his black coat a deeper shadow in the pre-dawn light. "We know you have her," James Montgomery's voice boomed off. "The stone. Return what's mine, and we'll respect the boundaries. Refuse, and we'll paint these rocks red." Standing Bear touched the warrior's feather he'd tied to his bow, a match to the one he'd dropped as warning. Inside the caves, Sarah's fever still raged, her delirious mumblings carrying tales of past horrors. He couldn't move her, not yet, which meant they had to hold. The first hunter died with an arrow in his throat, his torch spinning away into the undergrowth. The second fell to a thrown tomahawk, his skull split before he could level his rifle. The others dove for cover, but the ravine offered little protection from above. "Kill them all!" The butcher's command carried the same cold fury that had echoed. Over Bear Creek. Burn them out. Fire arrows arced toward the cave mouth, but Standing Bear's warriors had prepared for this. Wet hides draped over the entrance absorbed the flames, sending up clouds of steam instead of fire. Through the haze, Standing Bear caught glimpses of more men arriving, too many. The butcher had brought an army. Inside the cave, 2 rivers worked. To break Sarah's fever, crushing herbs and muttering prayers as old as the stones themselves. Her skin burned like touchwood, ready to spark into flame, or ready to burn out completely. A bullet sparked off the rock near Standing Bear's head. He ducked back, noting how the hunters were adapting, learning to use the terrain. They had the numbers to wait them out, to starve them from their stronghold. But Standing Bear had grown up in these caves, knew their secrets like he knew his own heartbeat. They come from the South Ridge. Swift-Ear's warning carried just ahead of more gunfire. Standing Bear cursed softly. The hunters had found the high ground, were working to surround them. Time was running out. Sarah's voice suddenly cut through the chaos, clear and strong despite her fever. "Mother, I see her, by the water." 2 rivers looked up sharply. The fever breaks. But an explosion rocked the ravine. The hunters had packed powder charges into the cracks of the cliff face. Stone screamed against stone as ancient rock gave way. Through the dust and chaos, Standing Bear saw James Montgomery leading a charge toward the cave mouth, his men fanning out with deadly purpose. "Time to choose, savage!" The butcher's voice carried over the ringing in Standing Bear's ears. "Give her up, or we'll bring the whole mountain down." Standing Bear knocked an arrow, the warrior's feather brushing his cheek as he drew. Through the settling dust, he had a clear shot at James Montgomery's throat. 1 arrow could end this, but the price would be a war his people couldn't survive. The decision was taken from him as Sarah stumbled from 2 rivers' grip, pushing past the wet hides to stand in the cave mouth. Her fever-bright eyes fixed on her uncle with a clarity that belied her condition. "You won't have me," she called out, her voice carrying the strength of breaking chains. "Any more than you had her." The butcher's face twisted with rage. "Just like your mother. She thought she could defy me too. Thought her savage lover would save her." His rifle came up. "The river took her. Guess we'll see if you fall faster." Before he could fire, Sarah ripped the compass from her neck and hurled it at his feet. The brass case shattered on the rocks, spilling not just the needle and dial, but a tightly folded paper that caught the rising wind. James Montgomery's face went white as the paper unfurled, revealing writing that Standing Bear couldn't read, but whose impact was clear in the sudden silence that gripped the ravine. "Mother's letter," Sarah said, swaying but unbowed. "The one that proves who really killed her. I found it hidden in the compass case years ago. Shall I tell your men what really happened at Bear Creek?" Silence gripped the ravine like a held breath. Sarah's torn wedding dress, now used as bandages around her wounded arm, fluttered in the dawn breeze, white silk stained with blood and earth. She stayed upright through sheer will, though the fever still burned through her veins. James Montgomery's. Men looked between him and the letter at his feet, uncertainty replacing bloodlust in their eyes. The butcher's face had gone from white to purple, his knuckles bone white on his rifle. "Lies," he spat. "Your mother was weak, manipulated by savages, just like you." Standing Bear moved to Sarah's side, his presence solid as the stone walls around. Tell them," he said softly. "Tell them what your mother wrote." Sarah's voice gained strength with each word. "She wrote about the gold you found on Shawnee land, about how you murdered their people at Bear Creek to hide your theft. How you killed her when she threatened to expose you." The letter danced across the bloody ground like a restless spirit. One of the hunters snatched it up, eyes widening as he read. James Montgomery's rifle swung toward him, but others were already moving to see the evidence for themselves. "She lies." The butcher's voice cracked. "Kill them! Kill them all!" But his men were backing away, years of brutal loyalty crumbling in the face of written truth. They had followed him in ignorance. Now they knew the blood price of their obedience. "You'll hang for Bear Creek," one of the older hunters said, his rifle barrel dropping. "All these years we thought—" James Montgomery's answer came in lead. The hunter fell, a bullet in his chest. Chaos erupted as men dove for cover, no longer certain who their enemies were. More shots rang out, echoing off the ravine walls like thunder. Standing Bear grabbed Sarah as her legs finally gave out. "Inside!" he commanded, pulling her back into the cave's shelter. Two Rivers was there to catch her, his medicine bag already. "Open, the fever rises again," the healer warned. "She needs rest, not battle." Sarah fought against the darkness crowding her vision. "My mother. She knew your father." Standing Bear's face softened for the first time since she'd met him. "They loved each other. Your uncle discovered their plan to expose his crimes. The river." He paused, old pain surfacing. "We found her too late." "Not too late," Sarah managed, though the cave was starting to spin. She left the letter, left the truth. Gunfire continued outside, but it was sporadic now. Men shouting, horses screaming, the sound of justice and vengeance colliding in the morning light. "Your uncle will not stop," Standing Bear said, checking his arrows. "He cannot afford to let you live, now that they know." Sarah clutched at his arm as he rose to return to the fight. The silk of her shredded wedding dress pulled against her wounds, a reminder of everything she'd left behind. "Why did you help?" "Me? Really?" Standing Bear touched the warrior's feather on his bow. "Because I saw in you what my father saw in your mother, the courage to break chains, no matter the cost." His eyes met hers. "And because some debts can only be paid in trust." A bullet smacked into the cave wall, sending stone chips flying. Standing Bear moved to the entrance, bow ready. "Rest," he said. "Let the medicine work. I will ensure your mother's truth sees the light." Sarah wanted to protest, to stand and fight beside him, but the fever was rolling back like a dark tide. The last thing she saw was Standing Bear silhouetted against the dawn, his father's war club now strapped across his back alongside his bow. A warrior carrying the weight of 2 generations' worth of justice. As consciousness faded, Sarah thought she felt cool fingers brush her forehead. For a moment, she wasn't sure if it was 2 rivers tending her fever or her mother's spirit, reaching across time and death to witness truth, finally emerging into light. Outside, James Montgomery's voice rose in one final rage-filled command. Standing Bear's bow sang in response, and Sarah slipped into darkness, knowing that when she woke, one way or another, the story her mother had died trying to tell would finally be heard. Sarah woke to firelight and soft voices. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. A wampum belt lay beside her bedding, its intricate beadwork telling stories she couldn't yet read. White shells for peace, purple for paths taken, and red, so much red, for blood spilled. And promises broken. The council has spoken. 2 Rivers' voice carried from the cave entrance. "They say helping her breaks the last peace we have with the settlers. Peace built on lies is no peace at all." Standing Bear's reply was soft but firm. Sarah kept her eyes closed, listening. How many more will die to hide one man's crimes? The butcher has fled to the fort. He spreads tales of savage attacks, of his niece bewitched by Indian devils. The settlers gather with torches and rifles, seeking revenge for Bear Creek all over again. Sarah's fingers found the wampum belt, tracing its patterns. The beads felt warm, alive with stories. She thought of her mother's letter, now being passed from hand to hand among the hunters who had abandoned her uncle's cause. Would truth be enough to prevent more bloodshed? "You risk everything for her." 2 Rivers spoke again, closer now. "The council says your judgment is clouded, that you see your father's love story repeating itself. My father died protecting what was right." Standing Bear's voice held an edge. "Would you have me do less?" "I would have you live, brother. and I would not see our people suffer for one settler woman's cause, no matter how just. Sarah opened, her eyes then unable to stay silent. I won't let more die for my sake. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Both men turned, surprised to find her awake. I'll go to the fort myself, show them the truth, and be shot before you speak a word. Standing Bear moved to her side, checking her bandages with gentle hands. Your uncle's lies have poisoned their minds. They will not listen now. Sarah caught his hand as he withdrew. The touch sent something electric through them both. Then what do we do? Standing Bear's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the same wild hope she felt stirring in her own heart. A hope as forbidden as it was powerful. Two rivers made a small sound of warning. The old stories speak of this, the healer said. When two worlds touch, blood follows, always blood. The old stories also speak of change, Standing Bear replied, not breaking Sarah's gaze. Of bridges built between worlds. Bridges that burned. Two rivers touched the wampum belt. Remember your duty, Standing Bear. You are a war chief's son. And I'm my father's daughter, Sarah said firmly. We both carry their legacy, but we're not them. We can write our own story. Standing Bear's hand tightened on hers. Outside, a wolf howled, a lone voice soon joined by others. The sound carried warning, riders approaching. Two rivers moved to the cave mouth. Your uncle's lies bear fruit. Settlers from 3 villages ride with torches. They mean to burn us out, cleanse the evil spirits they think possess the butchers. Niece, Sarah tried to rise, but Standing Bear held her down. You're not strong enough. I'm stronger than you think. She pulled herself up despite his protest, and I won't hide while others die for my cause. Standing Bear studied her face in the firelight. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. Then we face it together. He reached for his father's war. A club, then hesitated. Instead, he lifted the wampum belt. This tells the story of the first peace between our peoples, he said, draping it across her shoulders. Perhaps it's time to add new beads, write a new chapter. Two rivers made a pained sound. The council will not approve. The council is not here. Standing Bear's voice carried the weight of decision. And some choices are worth any price. Sarah touched the belt, feeling the weight of history in its beads. Like our parents? Like our parents, Standing Bear agreed. But this time, the story ends differently. Outside, the wolf calls grew closer. Through the cave mouth, Sarah could see torchlight approaching through the trees. Two rivers began gathering his medicines, his movements speaking of resignation and acceptance. Standing. Bear helped Sarah to her feet. She swayed but stayed standing, one hand on his arm, the other touching the wampum belt. Together, they faced the cave entrance and the coming storm. Tell me, she said softly. How do your people say, I trust you? Standing Bear spoke the words. In his language, the syllables carrying weight and promise. Sarah repeated them carefully, feeling the shape of this new truth in her mouth. His eyes widened at her pronunciation, understanding the deeper meaning she offered. Behind them, two rivers sighed. So be it, the healer said. May the spirits have mercy on us all. The torches drew closer, and with them the sound of angry voices. But in that moment, with forbidden words still hanging in the air between them, Sarah felt no fear, only certainty, as solid as the cave walls around them. Whatever came next, they would face it as neither settler nor Shawnee, but as something new, something unprecedented, something free. The old letter crinkled in Sarah's hands, her mother's fading words illuminated. By torchlight, Standing Bear stood guard at the cave mouth, watching the approaching flames draw closer through the trees, but his attention kept returning to the paper that had changed everything. Read it again, he said softly. All of it, this time. Sarah's voice trembled as she read the words she'd found hidden in her father's compass years ago, waiting for the right moment to reveal their truth. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I have failed to escape the cage your uncle built around us all. The gold he discovered on Shawnee land was never his to take. When Chief Running Wolf's son, a man I grew to love more than life itself, helped me gather evidence of James's crimes, your uncle responded with fire and blood at Bear Creek. Now he threatens to kill you, my precious child, if I expose him. By the time you read this, I will have tried one last time to reach the Shawnee with proof of his treachery. If I fail, the truth dies with me. The compass holds more than direction, dear one. It holds hope. Look to the north, where love knows no boundaries. Your loving mother, Elizabeth. 2 rivers appeared from the deeper cave shadows, carrying Sarah's father's compass, now broken, its secrets finally spilled. Your father knew, he said, about your mother and our chief's son. He gave her this compass, helped her try to reach us, and died for it, Sarah whispered. The hunting accident that killed him 3 days later, another of Uncle's murders. Standing Bear's hand tightened on his bow. My father died trying to reach her that night, the night the river took her. His voice carried years of pain. I was too young to understand then, too young to help. The sounds of approaching riders grew louder. Sarah carefully folded the letter, tucking it into her shirt beside her heart. They'll be here soon. Settlers rallied by my uncle's lies coming to finish what he started at Bear Creek. Not this time. Standing Bear turned to her, moonlight catching the warrior's paint on his face. This time we have your mother's words. This time we have proof. Words that will die with us if we can't survive the night. 2 Rivers warned. The settlers come with fire in their hearts, minds poisoned by the butcher's tales of witchcraft and savage spells. Sarah touched the broken compass, its brass case still warm from being carried so close to her skin all these years. Then we make them listen, not as settlers or Shawnee, but as people who've all been deceived by one man's greed. Standing Bear nodded slowly. Your mother tried to build a bridge between our peoples. She died before she could finish. But we, Sarah corrected, taking his hand. We finish what they started. 2 rivers made a sound caught between resignation and hope. The old ones say blood trails can only end 2 ways, in more blood or in transformation. He lifted the broken compass. Your mother chose transformation. She died for that choice. She died for truth, Sarah said firmly. And truth is like water. It finds a way, no matter what stands in its path. Standing Bear touched the letter through her shirt, his hand lingering over her heart. Then let us be the way it finds, together. Outside, the first riders appeared through the trees, torches held high. Sarah squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of her mother's courage flowing through her veins, along with her father's quiet strength. The broken compass had led her here, to this moment, to this choice. Standing Bear lifted his father's war club in one hand, but offered her the other. Sarah took it without hesitation. Together, they stepped toward the cave mouth, and whatever fate awaited them in the torchlit night. Behind them, 2 rivers began to chant, not a war song, but something older. A prayer for transformation, for bridges unburned, for blood trails ending not in death, but in new paths forward. The tribal medallion lay in the dirt, its polished surface reflecting torchlight like a fallen star. Grey Wolf had thrown it at Standing Bear's feet moments before, stripping him of his rank as war chief. Now the old man stood with the other tribal elders on the ridge above the cave, their presence as heavy as storm clouds. You were warned. Grey Wolf's voice carried over the growing chaos. Now you bring an army to our doors. For one settler woman, you risk everything. Below, the settlers' torches dotted the forest like fireflies, drawing closer. James Montgomery's lies had worked better than even he could have hoped. 3 villages worth of armed men, all believing they came to rescue the butcher's niece from savage kidnappers. They don't come for her, Standing Bear replied, not reaching, for the fallen medallion. They come because of a lie that's poisoned these lands for 15 years, a lie we can finally end. Sarah stepped forward, her mother's letter clutched in one hand. Your own chief's son died trying to expose my uncle's crimes. Will you dishonor his sacrifice by hiding the truth now? Grey Wolf's face hardened. His choices brought death to our people once before, and now his son makes the same mistake, trusting a settler's words over his own people's safety. From the shadows behind the elders emerged 3 warriors Sarah hadn't seen before. Their faces were painted for war, but they carried no Shawnee weapons. Instead, they held settlers' rifles. "Your uncle sends his regards," the tallest warrior said to Sarah, his voice thick with contempt. "He offers peace between our peoples in exchange for you." Standing Bear's hand went to his father's war club, but he was surrounded. 2 Rivers stepped up beside him, medicine bag in hand. "Think carefully, brothers," the healer warned. "Betrayal marks the soul deeper than any war paint." "The real betrayal was letting her live," the warrior with the rifle replied. "The council has decided. She dies and the settlers withdraw. Our people survive." Sarah felt the weight of her mother's letter, the truth it carried seeming so fragile against rifle barrels and ancient fears. But Standing Bear's presence beside her stood firm as mountain stone, unbowed by his people's rejection. "You speak of survival," he said to Grey Wolf, "but what survives if we abandon truth for comfort? If we become what we once fought against?" "Pretty words," the warrior sneered, "from a chief no longer." He gestured with his rifle. "The girl comes with us. Anyone who interferes dies." 2 Rivers moved suddenly, throwing something from his medicine bag. Smoke billowed up, acrid and disorienting. Sarah felt Standing Bear's hand close around her arm, pulling her toward a side passage she hadn't noticed before. "Your father showed me this path," he said as they ran, his voice tight with pain, not from any wound but from his people's choice. "The night he tried to reach your mother." Behind them, shouts and confusion echoed through the cave system. The sound of rifles firing split the air, followed by screams. Whether from friend or foe, Sarah couldn't tell. They emerged onto a narrow ledge, the moon painting the valley below in silver shadows. The settlers' torches moved through the trees like a river of fire, and somewhere in that chaos, her uncle waited, spinning his web of lies ever tighter. "I won't let you lose everything for me," Sarah said, trying to pull away. "Your people made their choice." Standing Bear's voice was iron. "As I make mine." He touched her face, his fingers leaving traces of warrior's paint on her skin. "Some prices are worth paying." Below, the torches began to converge on the cave system. Above, Grey Wolf's voice called out commands to find them. They stood suspended between 2 worlds, both turned hostile, with only the truth of her mother's letter and the strength of their shared conviction as weapons. Sarah touched the warriors, paint on her cheek, feeling the weight of transformation in its mark. They had lost everything. Her inheritance, his tribe, their places in the world. Everything except each other. The meeting stick lay between them, its surface carved with symbols pointing to their rendezvous point. Standing Bear worked quickly, adding final marks as the sound of pursuit grew closer. Sarah memorized each line, each curve, a language of survival scratched into wood. "The settlers' camp lies here," he said, indicating a series of notches. "Your uncle will be with them, watching the main trails, but there's a way through if you're careful." His knife added another mark. "Follow the brook where it narrows. Wait for my signal at moonrise." Sarah gripped the stick, its rough surface, grounding her in the moment. "And if you don't come, I'll come." His voice carried absolute certainty. 2 Rivers still has allies in the council, once they read your mother's letter, and if they don't, Sarah challenged, if they choose safety over truth, like the others. Standing Bear's hands stilled on the stick. In the distance, dogs began to bay, her uncle's hunters following their trail. The pursuers were using both settler and Shawnee tactics now, a twisted cooperation born of manipulation and fear. "Then we make our own path," he said finally, "like our parents tried to do, but this time—" He pressed something into her hand, a single warrior's feather stained with the same paint that marked his face. "This time we finish what they started." Sarah tucked the feather into her shirt beside her mother's letter. The weight of both sat against her heart, truth and trust combined. "The settlers won't shoot one of their own on sight," she said. "I can get close enough to be heard. Make them understand, while I lead the hunters east." Standing Bear nodded. "Away from the camp. Once they're scattered." His fingers traced the final symbol on the meeting stick. "Here, when the moon touches the tall pine." Voices echoed through the trees behind them, growing closer. They had lingered too long already. Sarah clutched the meeting stick, trying to memorize Standing Bear's face in the fading light. The warrior paint made him seem like a spirit of the forest itself, but his eyes held very human emotions. "If my uncles turned your own people against you," she whispered, "what chance do we have of turning his men back to truth?" Standing Bear touched her face, leaving a streak of paint across her cheek to match his own. "Truth is like water," he quoted her words back to her. "It finds a way." His hand dropped to the empty place at his belt where the tribal medallion had hung. "Sometimes the way must be carved through stone, but it finds a path." The dogs bayed again, much closer now. Standing Bear pressed the meeting stick into her hands one final time, his fingers lingering on hers. "Go," he said. "Stay alive. Find the way." Sarah turned to flee, then stopped. Before she could think better of it, she grabbed Standing Bear's shirt and pulled him close, pressing her lips to his. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single point of contact, settler and Shawnee, duty and freedom, past and future meeting in one desperate moment. Then they broke apart, both breathing hard. Standing Bear's eyes were wide, the warrior's, and paint not quite hiding his flush. "That was for luck," Sarah said, managing a fierce smile. "Don't be late for our meeting." She plunged into the undergrowth before he could respond, clutching the meeting stick like a lifeline. Behind her, she heard Standing Bear moving in the opposite direction, already calling out in Shawnee, drawing their pursuers away from her trail. The brook lay ahead, just as the stick's markings showed. Sarah forced herself to move carefully, despite the urgency pounding in her blood. One mistake now would doom them both. The stick's symbols guided her through gathering darkness, each one a promise of reunion. Her mother had tried to bridge these two worlds with truth, had died with that truth untold. Now Sarah carried both the letter and the warrior's feather, felt the paint on her cheek like a second skin. She was no longer just Elizabeth Montgomery's daughter, running from lies. She was something new, something unprecedented. The moon began to rise as she reached the narrow part of the brook. Soon it would touch the tall pine. Soon she would know if truth really could cut through 15 years of hatred and fear. Soon she would learn if love could succeed where justice had failed. Sarah touched the meeting stick one last time, then tucked it safely away. Ahead lay her uncle's men, armed with rifles and righteousness. Behind lay Standing Bear, drawing their hunters into shadow, and somewhere between, like water finding its way through stone, truth waited to carve a new path. Forward, mixed warrior paint gleamed dully in the moonlight as two rivers worked. His weathered hands moved with practiced care, mixing the sacred pigments of his people with the red ochre Sarah had recognized from settler ceremonies. On a flat stone before him lay the final product, a bridge between worlds, rendered in earth. "And root, the old ones speak of such mixing as blasphemy," he said, dipping his fingers in the paint. "But the old ones never saw what we face tonight." Around them, in the shadowed grove, figures moved with quiet purpose, those few from both peoples who had chosen to stand with them. Mason Reed, her uncle's former tracker, checked his rifle while watching Two Rivers work. "Butcher's got most. Believing the girl's been enslaved by spirits," he spat. "Convenient way to hide the truth about Bear Creek. But some of us remembered Elizabeth, remembered the questions she asked before she died." Sarah touched her mother's letter, safely hidden beneath her shirt. More of her uncle's men had defected after reading it, bringing with them tales of other crimes, other cover-ups. But James Montgomery still commanded fierce loyalty from those who preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. "How many stand with us?" she asked Reed. 20 settlers. Those who knew your mother mostly. Those who've spent 15 years wrestling. With the things we did at Bear Creek. He nodded toward the shadows where Shawnee warriors moved. How many of them? 12. Two Rivers answered, beginning to apply the mixed paint to a young warrior's face. Those who remember Standing Bear's father. Those who believe truth matters more than fear. Not enough, Sarah thought, but didn't say. Against her uncles. Forces, and the tribe's warriors who'd turned against them, they were desperately outnumbered. But numbers weren't everything. Her mother had stood alone with her truth, and though she'd fallen, the seed she'd planted had finally taken root. A whisper passed through the trees. Standing Bear, returning from his scouting. Sarah's heart leapt before she could control it, drawing a knowing look from Two Rivers. The warrior moved like a shadow through the moonlight, his own paint marking him as both leader and outcast. The butcher camps at the fork, he reported, crouching beside their small council. 40 men, well armed. Grey Wolf's hunters moved to join him, 10 rifles among them. His jaw tightened. They wear settler clothes now, as if they could trade their spirits for safety. And the tribe? Two Rivers asked quietly. Divided. Some. Listen to your messages. Read the woman's letter. Others. Standing Bear's hand touched the empty place where his medallion had hung. Others choose the easy path. Sarah moved closer, letting her shoulder brush his. He stilled at the contact, then leaned slightly into it. Two Rivers pretended not to notice as he continued mixing paint. We're still outnumbered, Mason Reed said bluntly, and they hold the high ground. Numbers are not spirit, Two Rivers replied, and high ground means nothing to truth. He held up the mixed paint. Tonight we wear both people's colors. Tonight we show them what rises when lies fall. One by one, their small band gathered to receive the paint. Settlers who had once hunted Shawnee now knelt to receive their marks. Warriors who had fought settlers now accepted touches of red ochre among their traditional designs. Sarah watched as Two Rivers worked, turning their small force into something new, something that transcended the boundaries both sides had died to maintain. Standing Bear was last to kneel. Two Rivers studied him for a long moment before adding new marks to his war paint. Your father wore these marks, the healer said softly, the night he died, trying to save her mother. Tonight, they mean something different. Tonight, they mark a new path. When Standing Bear raised his head, Sarah caught her breath. The mixed paint transformed him into something both familiar and strange, both settler and Shawnee, both warrior and protector. Two Rivers turned to her next, his fingers cool against her skin, as he matched her marks to Standing Bear's. The moon nears the tall pine, Mason Reed warned, checking his rifle again. If we're to do this thing, it must be soon. Sarah touched the fresh paint on her face, feeling its weight like a second skin. Around her, their small army of truth-seekers made final preparations. Settlers checked weapons while warriors blessed arrows. Two Rivers packed away his paints while whispering prayers in both languages. Standing, Bear caught her hand, his fingers twining with hers. In the moonlight, their matched paint made them seem like creatures of shadow and story, myth made real. Ready? He asked softly. Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling the warrior's feather and her mother's letter pressed against her heart. Ready to make them listen, she replied. Ready to make them see. Above them, the moon climbed toward the tall pine's crown. Below, in the valley, her uncle's fires burned like fallen stars. The time for hiding, for running, for fearing was past. Now came the time for truth to carve its path through stone. The peace pipe lay shattered in the firelight, its pieces scattered like broken promises across the blood-stained ground. James Montgomery stood in the center of his camp, his black coat rippling in the night wind as he faced the semicircle of armed men. My own niece, he spat, pacing before the fire, bewitched by savage magic, turned against her own blood by their heathen. Oh, tricks! His voice carried across the assembled settlers and turncoat Shawnee warriors. Will we let them poison our families? Turn daughter against father, sister against brother, A chorus of angry shouts answered him. Sarah watched from the shadows at the edge of the firelight, her mixed war paint making her one with the darkness. Around the camp's perimeter, she knew, Standing Bear and their allies waited, ready to spring the trap. "Show yourself, girl," James bellowed into the night. "Face the consequences of your betrayal." Sarah stepped into the light. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they saw her paint, her transformed appearance. She held her mother's letter high. "The only betrayal here is yours, Uncle. 15 years of lies, murder, and greed." "More savage tricks," James snarled, but she saw the fear in his eyes as he recognized the paper. "More witches' work." "It's Elizabeth's hand," one of the older settlers called out. "I'd know her writing anywhere." "Read it," another voice demanded. "Let's hear these so-called lies." James's rifle came up. "She reads nothing. This ends now." An arrow knocked the weapon from his hands. Standing Bear emerged from the darkness opposite Sarah, his mixed paint gleaming. Their small army materialized behind them, settlers and Shawnee standing shoulder to shoulder. "It ends when truth is heard," Standing Bear declared. Chaos erupted. James's loyal men opened fire as Grey Wolf's hunters charged from the tree line. Sarah dove behind a fallen log as bullets splintered wood around her. Through the smoke and muzzle flashes, she saw Standing Bear engaging Grey Wolf himself, war club meeting rifle stock in a clash of old and new. Two Rivers appeared at her side, pressing a loaded rifle into her hands. "Make it count," he said, before vanishing back into the fray. Sarah recognized the weapon, her father's old hunting rifle, carried by one of the defecting settlers. She sighted down the barrel, searching for her uncle in the chaos. Through the smoke, she glimpsed him rallying his men for a charge. Her finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. No, death wasn't the answer. Truth was, Sarah climbed atop the log instead, holding the letter high. "Listen," she shouted above the din. "Listen to my mother's words." Her voice carried the same strength Elizabeth's had all those years ago. Fighters paused, turning toward her as she read the truth of Bear Creek, of stolen gold, of murders hidden behind lies. It poured out like a cleansing rain. "Lies!" James charged toward her, knife drawn. "I'll silence you like I silenced her." Standing Bear's war club took him in the chest, sending him sprawling. But James rolled to his feet with surprising agility, slashing with his knife. Blood bloomed on Standing Bear's arm. Sarah's rifle came up instinctively. This time her finger didn't waver on the trigger. The shot took James in the shoulder, spinning him around. His knife flew from his grip as he fell. Silence descended on the battlefield. Sarah kept her father's rifle trained on her uncle as she walked forward. 15 years, she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. 15 years of poison, turning us against each other. No more. Grey Wolf stepped forward, his own paint smeared with blood and smoke. "The girl speaks truth. I have read the letter, have seen the proof." He turned to his warriors. "We dishonor ourselves, fighting to hide a murderer's lies." James tried to rise, but settler rifles and Shawnee arrows alike held him in place. Mason Reed stepped forward to bind him. "Territorial court will want to hear about Bear Creek," the tracker said, "and Elizabeth Montgomery's murder, and a few other mysteries that need clearing up." Sarah lowered her rifle as Standing Bear joined her. His war club still dripped with her uncle's blood, but his eyes held only concern for her. "You chose truth over vengeance," he said softly. "Truth was vengeance," she replied, watching as her uncle was led away. The best kind. Around them, settlers. And Shawnee began to lower their weapons. Grey Wolf and Two Rivers moved among the wounded, offering help regardless of origin. The mixed paint they all wore seemed to glow in the firelight, marking them as something new, something that transcended the old boundaries. The broken peace pipe caught Sarah's eye. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to make a new one sealed, with truth instead of lies. The new wampum belt grew beneath Two Rivers' skilled hands as dawn painted the sky in shades of hope. White beads for peace, purple for the paths that had led them here, and red, not for blood this time, but for the bonds forged in trial. Sarah watched him work. Her mother's letter spread carefully on a clean cloth beside the growing belt. Around them, the aftermath of battle transformed into something unexpected. Settlers and Shawnee warriors worked side by side, tending wounds, sharing stories, beginning to bridge the chasm 15 years of lies had carved between them. Their mixed war paint, though smudged and battle-stained, still marked them as something new. "Your mother would be proud," Mason Reed said, settling beside her with a grunt. The old tracker's arm was bandaged where one of Grey Wolf's arrows had found him before the truth came out. "She tried to tell us about Bear Creek, about your uncle's real nature. We were too blind to see it then." "And now?" Sarah asked, watching as Standing Bear approached with Grey Wolf, their faces solemn with the weight of new understanding. "Now we see too much," Reed replied. 15 years of blood and hate, all built on lies. It'll take more than one night's truth to heal that." Standing Bear and Grey Wolf joined them around Two Rivers' working space, the tribal elders' eyes fixed on the growing wampum belt, reading the story Two Rivers wove into its patterns. "Your father would be proud as well," Grey Wolf said to Standing Bear. "He saw the path ahead of us all, died trying to forge it." The old man's fingers traced the empty air where Standing Bear's medallion should have hung. "We dishonored his memory by choosing fear over truth." From within his robes, Grey Wolf produced the tribal medallion he had stripped from Standing Bear only days ago. But instead of returning it, he placed it beside Sarah's mother's letter. Two Rivers nodded and began adding new beads to the belt, incorporating the medallion's symbols into the pattern. "Some paths can only be walked together," Grey Wolf continued. "Your father knew this. Elizabeth Montgomery knew this. Perhaps it is time we honored their wisdom instead of hiding from it." Standing Bear's hand found Sarah's, their fingers twining together. The mixed paint they wore had been renewed by Two Rivers, no longer marking them as outcasts, but as bridges between worlds. "The territorial court will want to hear the full truth," Mason Reed said. "About Bear Creek, about Elizabeth, about all of it." He looked at Grey Wolf. "Will your people speak?" "We will speak," Grey Wolf nodded. "Too much has been buried too long." He turned to Sarah. "Your mother tried to bring healing. It cost her life, but the seeds she planted." He gestured to the mixed company around them. "They finally bloom." Two Rivers added the final beads to the belt, then held it up for all to see. In its intricate patterns, Sarah could read the story of these days, the flight, the chase, the revelation of truth, and the beginning of healing. But woven through it all was an older story, one of her mother and Standing Bear's father, of love and courage that had waited 15 years to bear fruit. "A new peace," Two Rivers said, "built on truth this time." He handed the belt not to Grey Wolf or Mason Reed, but to Sarah and Standing Bear together. "And new bridges to help us cross the old divides." Sarah ran her fingers over the beadwork, feeling the weight of past and future in its patterns. Beside her, Standing Bear did the same, his warrior's hands gentle on the delicate craft. "Your uncle heads to territorial court today," Mason Reed said. "Thanks to your mother's letter and our testimony, he'll never taste free air again. Bear Creek's ghosts can rest easier now." "And what of us?" Sarah asked, looking up at Standing Bear. "Where do we belong now?" Grey Wolf answered, before Standing Bear could. "You belong to the path you've made, to the bridge you've built." He touched the wampum belt. "Your paint marks you as both peoples and neither. Something new, something needed." Standing Bear's free hand came up to trace the paint on Sarah's cheek. "The old stories speak of spirit walkers," he said softly. "Those who could walk between worlds, bringing understanding. Perhaps that's what your mother and my father saw coming, what they died trying to create." Sarah leaned into his touch, feeling the truth of it in her bones. They were something unprecedented, something born of courage and sacrifice and love. Around them, settlers and Shawnee continued their cautious dance of reconciliation, guided by the example of their mixed paint and shared purpose. The wampum belt caught the rising sun, its beads glowing with promise. Not an ending, Sarah realized, but a beginning. A new trail blazed through old hatred, marked by truth instead of lies, love instead of fear. A path wide enough for all to walk together. 1 year later, Sarah stood at her mother's final resting place by the river's edge. Around her neck hung a unique creation, her mother's pearls interwoven with Shawnee beads, telling both sides of her story. Standing Bear's hand rested warm and steady on her shoulder as she placed fresh flowers beside the new marker. The territorial court had delivered justice at last. James Montgomery would never again see freedom, his crimes finally laid bare before all. Bear Creek's truth had sparked changes that rippled through both communities, healing wounds 15 years in the festering. She would be proud, Standing Bear said softly, of the path we've carved. Sarah touched the combined necklace, feeling the smooth pearls and rough beads beneath her fingers. The mixed adornment marked her new role. Along with Standing Bear, they had become bridges between their peoples. When disputes arose, they were called to mediate. When understanding faltered, they helped translate more than just words. Grey Wolf appeared through the morning mist, his aged steps sure on the familiar path. The tribal elder carried himself differently now, the burden of old lies lifted from his shoulders. Behind him came Mason Reed and Two Rivers, an unlikely friendship forged in shared truth. The new trading post opens today, Grey Wolf announced, built on the boundary line, belonging to neither people and both. His eyes crinkled with something like pride. They ask that you both preside over its opening. Sarah smiled, remembering the broken peace pipe from that night of revelation. Now a new one waited at the trading post, its first lighting meant to seal the peace they'd all built together. Your mother sought to bridge these waters, Two Rivers said, gesturing to the river that had claimed her. Now her daughter helps bridge these peoples. Standing Bear's arm slipped around Sarah's waist, his touch familiar and grounding. Their love had blazed a trail others now followed. 3 more unions between their peoples had been blessed in recent months, each one wearing the mixed paint they had pioneered. The old hatred dies slowly, Mason Reed warned, ever practical. But it dies sure when truth and love stand guard. Sarah turned from her mother's grave, ready to face the future they'd all built together. The combined necklace caught the morning light, casting patterns that danced like hope across the water. Come, she said, taking Standing Bear's hand. We have a trading post to open, a peace pipe to light, and new stories to write. As they walked away from the river, Sarah thought she felt her mother's smile in the warm breeze that followed them. Elizabeth Montgomery had died trying to forge this path. Now her daughter walked it freely, surrounded by the fruits of her courage. The river flowed on behind them, its waters no longer a barrier but a meeting place, its banks no longer a boundary, but a gathering ground. And around Sarah's neck, pearls and tribal beads told a story of transformation, of how a runaway bride and a warrior son had turned ancient enemies into family, one truth at a time.